We must start from the simple premise that Africa's future is up to Africans.
Barack Obama was embraced as the son of a Kenyan and the first African-American president. Nearly 8 years later, we'll look at the US president's legacy in Africa. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. When Barack Obama was elected President of the United States in 2008, his victory was celebrated across Africa. With his personal connection to Kenya, many on the continent considered him one of their own. During his administration, Mr. Obama made 4 trips to Sub-Saharan Africa, visiting 6 countries. He emphasized trade instead of aid, launching 2 programs, the Young African Leaders Initiative and Power Africa. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Angelo Coppola in Johannesburg. And Angelo, President Obama addressed students at the University of Cape Town in South Africa during a visit in 2013. He spoke about Nelson Mandela and how one man's courage can change the world. What do you believe will be Obama's legacy in South Africa?
Well, Anand, according to a presidential watcher here in South Africa, Obama exemplifies integrity, honesty, transparency. He's a good family man, essentially all a positive example to the world and specifically to South Africans. And he was also very strong on bilateral negotiations, and his administration always thought that South Africa punched below its weight. The Obama administration, I'm told, always made the point that Africa was seen as a US, China, Africa triple win opportunity. Practically, one impact point that Obama did succeed in doing was the renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. You'll remember that when South Africa dragged its heels on certain aspects, like on poultry imports, Obama, via his trade representative, forced the issue and brought the deal back on track. Then there's Power Africa, as you've mentioned, an Obama initiative aimed at, in fact, doubling access to energy for Africans. It's exceeded its initial targets, and the roadmap to 2030 now is codified in US law, which means that the president-elect will find it difficult to rescind it if he were to do that. And while it will have a limited impact on South Africa, it's a good starting point for the continent because it's going to mean the crowding in of funding. Anand?
Now, Angela, as we are all aware, South Africa is facing the largest HIV epidemic in the world, with an estimated 7 million people living with the virus. US President George W. Bush created the government initiative, the US government initiative called the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Was that program supported by the Obama administration when this president came to power?
Well, initially, you'll recall that the Obama administration slashed the funding to PEPFAR. That surprised many, and there was a lot of criticism around it. But I've been told that Obama is an evidence-based decision maker, and over the years, funding has been increased. In fact, there's a fact sheet that was released by the White House in July of this year, in fact, that suggests that the administration is back on track to meet its new target of some 12.9 million people on treatment by 2017. And they're also hoping to reduce the new HIV infection rates among adolescent women. It's a noble objective, but if we weigh it against what's happening in South Africa in terms of infection rates, for example, here we're seeing an estimated 1,000 people who are infected with HIV every single day. So there's a long battle ahead of us. But there is a ray of hope here. Yesterday in South Africa, we heard about a new 4-year vaccine-based trial involving some 4,500 people. It's based on a successful trial in Thailand, and here's holding thumbs that will solve part of the scourge that we're facing in Africa. Anand?
Thanks, Angelo. That's CCTV's Angelo Coppola reporting from Johannesburg. Joining us now from Paris is Christina Okello. She's a journalist with Radio France International. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Monde Muyangwa. She's the director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and we're joined by Peter Pham. He's the Vice President of Research and Regional Initiatives and Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Christina, let's start with you in Paris. No sooner had Barack Obama been elected president than Africa claimed him to be one of their own, the son of Africa. There was a great deal of pride, as we remember. 8 years later, looking at it now, do you think Africans in Africa feel the same way?
Well, Armand, views are mixed here. On the one hand, yes, Obama still remains the uncontested superstar. The fact that the US elected their first African Kenyan president still remains a big deal for many Africans on the continent. His election symbolized that, for the first time, racial prejudice was no longer a barrier. It was finally over, and anyone, no matter where he or she came from, could succeed if they tried and one day make it to the White House. So there's still that sense of pride, as you mentioned, and that enthusiasm. But on the other hand, there is also criticism. Some experts I've been speaking to while covering this story have said that they really they expected more from Barack Obama being the first African president elected in the US to actually help the continent tackle notably its challenges when it comes to democracy. If we recall back in 2009 when he went on his first African tour, first of all to Cairo in Egypt and then Ghana shortly afterwards, he talked about launching this new beginning between the US and the Muslim world, including some African states. But he said also that he wanted African leaders to do more to help their populations come out of poverty. He wanted African leaders to do more to tackle corruption. So there was a tremendous amount of impetus and energy.
Okay, Peter, when we look at this administration's policy on Africa, is there any signature policy initiative by President Obama by which he'll be remembered in Africa? George Bush had the PEPFAR initiative, the fight against AIDS. Is there anything similar for President Obama?
I would make the argument that President Barack Obama, perhaps his greatest contribution to Africa and U.S.-Africa relations in particular, has been helping push a change of mindset from Africa as lacking in agency, Africa as a recipient of donor aid and assistance, to Africa as an opportunity, Africa as a business partner. The U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 2014 was the largest ever gathering of African leaders convened by a U.S. president, and included as a key part of it a U.S.-Africa Business Forum. This past September in New York, President Obama convened a second U.S.-Africa Business Forum. So the emphasis on the economic, commercial relationships, I think that's going to be remembered as I think a key contribution.
But how
on the other hand,
how was that translated how was that policy implemented in Africa? Did it change the lives of Africans?
Well, I think in the long term, it's the beginning of the change of a corporate mentality, and one can't underestimate. That being said, to answer your question about signature initiatives, there isn't a signature initiative on lines of Millennium Challenge, PEPFAR, from President George W. Bush, or the signing of AGOA, even the African Growth and Opportunity Act under President Clinton, although that was extended and renewed by President Bush and President Obama. There's been a lack of that, and I think that's a serious question. Now, there are a lack of resources, there are different fiscal environment, different political environment, all those things have to be factored in. But I think it's something, one of the things that spokesmen for the administration often cite as their signature initiative, it's an important one. I don't want to belittle, I think it's a very important, is the Young African Leaders Initiative, the YALI initiative, which brings young African leaders, the next generations, to Washington. But that only impacts 1,000 people a year. And so it's so almost embarrassing that is put up as the signature initiative.
Monde, there's been some criticism of Obama's policy or his engagement with Africa. The Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington said that he'd been insufficiently engaged in Africa and failed to make the case for its continued relevance in parts of the continent. Was Africa really a priority for this president, or was it on the back burner throughout his two terms?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it builds on what both Christina and Peter have talked about. I take a slightly more nuanced view of what the Obama legacy in Africa will be. First of all, I think, and I think Christina touched on this when she talked about it, we have to understand the political environment, both domestically and internationally, as well as the economic environment in which President Obama assumed office. Christina talked on about President being the first Black president with a very direct connection to the African continent. I think that raised unrealistically high expectations of the president, that he was going to put Africa front and center. However, the reality is Africa has never been in the vital interests of the United States. It was never going to be a priority in terms of a change of priority from previous presidents. So I think we have to understand that. A second piece of it for me has to do with the economic crisis in which this country was engulfed in 2008 when President Obama took office. I come from a county in Maryland where the foreclosure rate went up 400%, where the unemployment rate was in double figures. Had President Obama focused initially on the international environment rather than the challenges at home, I think he would have been rightly blamed for not showing leadership on the domestic issues that were impacting this country. I think a third issue that we have to take into account in assessing the Obama legacy in Africa really has to do with the political environment in Washington, which, for lack of a better term, I would call dysfunctional. And it got only more rancorous over the years. So that's a backdrop. Could President Obama have done some things differently? Absolutely. There's no question about that in my mind. And I would take slight issue with Peter when he talks about the signature programs under President Obama. First of all, we see a continuation of US-Africa policy from Clinton to Bush to Obama. There has been tremendous continuity in terms of on the policy front. What we do see is a shift in priorities and programs.
When you say continuity, what's the common thread?
The common thread for me are the issues that anchor US policy in Africa: peace and security, trade, investment, and economic development, issues of democracy and governance. Right. Those have been consistent when you go back from Clinton to Bush to Obama. What you see is a difference in emphasis within that larger framework. And what President Obama did, and which I agree with with Peter, is that he expanded the framework of economic engagement between the US and Africa. We went from Africa being seen as an aid recipient to an Africa that could be seen as a potential partner. But more importantly, and I don't think he gets enough credit for this, the US had a negative budgetary situation when President Obama came into office. Yeah. What he did was develop private partnerships to fuel that engagement on the economic front. I think that's something we need to give him credit for.
Peter, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and I would agree with all that. And in fact, one of the things I think President Obama deserves credit for, and it builds on this continuity theme that Monde just spoke about, President Bush, I think, doesn't get enough credit. When under President George W. Bush, the amount of US assistance to Africa quadrupled. Absolutely. And in the very tough fiscal environment that President Obama inherited, where most regions of the world in the 8 years of the Obama presidency, aid was cut by roughly 20%. Africa, more or less, is an accounting error. It's been maintained at the Bush levels. That in itself is an achievement. I give him credit for that. Where I would take issue is follow through on certain aspects. For example, the president gave a great speech in Ghana during his first term that Christina referred to, talking about democracy. And yet over 8 years, assistance for democracy and governance programs in Africa were cut by 45%. How can you be serious about the importance of democracy when you gut the funding for democracy virtually in half? There's a disconnect.
Let me get Christina's view on that. Christina,
I'd just like to offer my take, my perspective, if I can, just to build on your comments there, Peter. Yes, Obama has this criticism against him that he didn't do more to help African countries, but on the one hand, he was also quite bound by domestic policy back home in the US. A lot of experts I've spoken to have said that even if he wanted to, he wouldn't have been able to have done more because he had this. He sought so hard to represent himself, to portray himself as a president of all Americans. He didn't want to play the ethnic card or be perceived as being the president of the third world or being too black. So I think in some respects that if there is disappointment, it's perhaps not justified, but it's understandable because he had so much expectations on him already back home, and given that the racial question in the US is so explosive, he couldn't really run the risk of inflaming it even further, I think.
All right, Christina, let me be clear. I give him full credit for maintaining the level of aid. I don't think he could have increased the level of aid. There was no political will for that. Yeah. But what I criticize him for is how he chose to spend the money that he did have. He maintained the Bush levels of funding. That's an achievement. Credit should be given to that. But if you're going to talk democracy and governance in Africa, and you cut the portion of money that you spend on it by almost 50%, there's a disconnect here, and we have to acknowledge that there's a disconnect.
Go ahead.
I would agree with Peter on that. If there's one criticism or critique of the engagement that I would have on a U.S. policy towards Africa, it would be precisely on the governance front.
Right.
That the governance landscape on the African continent is changing. And yet the way in which we engage on this question has not changed. And it needs to change if Africa is to continue realizing the positives, the transformation that it has embarked on over the years. But I would add that as much as I would have liked to see more resources, more signature programs, say in the democracy and governance space, the cut in democracy and governance funding actually started in the Bush administration. That it has just steadily increased over the years in terms of the magnitude of what we are losing for engagement in that space. And so one hopes that with the new administration, there's going to be a revisiting of this issue of what the African governance landscape looks like, political landscape, and how we could better engage in that sphere.
All right, there is one other criticism of President Obama's role in Africa, and that is the U.S. military role on the continent. I will get to that in a moment, but first we're going to have to take a break.